In Yu-Gi-Oh! There are various cards that provide an alternative win condition to reducing your opponent's life points to 0 or making them run out of cards in their deck. Arguably none are more famous than Exodia. Simply holding all 5 of these cards in your hand is enough to net you the win. Obviously any deck running it is built around drawing those cards as fast as possible. Although it may not make for the most exciting match, the best case scenario would be to hold all 5 pieces in turn 1. As you can imagine though, this is fairly unlikely. In fact, if you were to go first, the only possible combination of cards to win would be if your hand was made up of only pieces of Exodia. The total number of combinations actually has a nice formula. In fact, it has its own notation, which we pronounce as n choose k. This is calculated using this equation, which says that n choose k is equal to n factorial divided by k factorial multiplied by n minus k factorial. As you may have gathered there, that exclamation mark notation is known as factorial. The factorial of a positive integer is the product of all the integers from 1 to that number. For example, 5 factorial is equal to 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. So the total number of potential opening hands is 40 choose 5, which is equal to 658,008. This means that if you go first in the duel, the probability of your hand being Exodia is 0.000000151,973. Clearly these are terrible odds, and it stands to reason that you have a better chance of having Exodia in your opening hand if you go second. Because going second means we'll have 6 cards in our hand as opposed to 5, we have a bit more flexibility in what we can draw while still having Exodia amongst that combination. If this hand contains all of Exodia, then we'll think of 5 of those cards in hand as fixed. After that, there are 35 possibilities for the final card, assuming we've done the sensible thing and made the deck the minimum size of 40. The total number of potential hands now is equal to 40 choose 6, which is 3,838,380. 35 of those possible outcomes we'll think of as good, i.e. containing Exodia. This means our probability of winning in our first turn here is 35 divided by 40 choose 6, which is equal to 0.00000911843. This is an improvement over going first, however it's still rather unlikely. We can push the number of cards we start out with in our hand a little bit further if we draw the right cards at the beginning. Back in the day, powerful cards like Pot of Greed, before it was banned, would make it almost like we had an extra card in our hand at the start, because we'd be giving up 1 card to play Pot of Greed, but in exchange we'd be gaining 2 more. We may have to be a little bit more creative now, but there's still plenty of combinations out there that can give us some good drawing power in our first turn. Let's use this Exodia deck I've thrown together as an example. It's by no means the best one out there, but it should help me to get my point across. If we draw something like Upstart Goblin or One Day of Peace straight away, then we can begin to look at different ways that we could win in our first turn. We could look at including these cards in our probability calculation. This would require us to consider branching outcomes. For example, now we may win with our first 6 cards, or we may not win straight away, but we may have Upstart Goblin in our hand and use that to draw the final piece. Looking at the different branching outcomes we have for just the 2 cards I've mentioned gives us the following possible branches to draw all 5 cards. There are lots of different rules we could also add that would lead us to a first turn win. We could continue to get more complicated with our calculations, but to avoid our maths getting out of hand, we could alternately have a computer aid us. Here I've loaded up R, which is a free piece of statistical software. If anyone's interested in trying some of these ideas, I put a link in the description to download it. We covered algorithms in the Final Fantasy video, but the main thing to remember for now is that an algorithm is essentially a list of instructions. So now we'll put some of those ideas in the video into action. Instead of telling RPG characters when and where to attack, we're going to try and tell the computer how we would play out an opening turn if we were trying to get Exodia out. First, let's assign all the cards in a deck a number from 1 to 40. We do this just to make things a bit simpler. We could use the actual card names, but it's a lot quicker to write the numbers 25, 26, 27 and 28 instead of constantly having to write left arm, left leg, right arm and right leg of the forbidden one. So what is the overall purpose of the code we want to write? We want to create a function that simulates your first turn of the duel. First things first, we'll name the function something simple and easy to remember, as if we go away and want to come back to see this code, we have a good idea of what the function is trying to achieve. You'll notice that there is a phrase, total games, inside the round brackets. This will be the variable we use later to decide how many times we want to run the simulation. Ideally when we're running code, the total number of games should be a high value. This gives us a chance to really explore different possible outcomes. As we saw earlier, the probabilities we're dealing with are very small, meaning if we chose a small number of games to simulate, we may never even see a successful attempt. Now the first thing we need to include in our function is a game counter, which will start at game 1. We also want to track the number of successes we have, so we create a success counter and set it initially equal to 0, since we haven't had any successes until we start running the code. Now for the heart of the simulation itself, we'll start with a while loop. Our rule will be until we've reached the desired number of runs, i.e. our total number of games, we keep simulating. The first thing we need to do is set our deck. To do this, we create a sequence of numbers from 1 to 40, and in our next line, we shuffle them around. This acts as if we're shuffling the deck. Now for our opening hand, let's imagine that we're going second. This means we want the first 6 cards in the deck sequence. That is done by creating our hand variable and setting it equal to this. The square brackets are now being used instead of round brackets from earlier. This isn't a stylistic choice, each type of bracket has its own purpose. The square brackets, for example, tell us which position in the sequence to look at. Here we're saying we want to take all the things from position 1 to position 6. Because we're imagining these 6 cards are coming from our deck, we also have to update our deck by setting it equal to itself, but only including the cards from position 7 and onwards. Unlike in regular maths, where saying something like x is equal to x plus 1 may not make that much sense, it's quite common practice in coding to say something is equal to itself plus some kind of change. Our job now is to tell our code to keep making moves until no more legal moves exist. Once again, this is done using a while loop that says if there's a drawing type move, keep going. First, above that, let's set our possible move to true, so the loop knows that it's okay to start. Since our objective is to try and draw Exodia, we'll set an Exodia variable equal to false, indicating that we haven't drawn it yet. This will only be set to true if we manage to get all 5 pieces. Now inside the loop, let's set that move variable to false. We do that because at this point in time we haven't checked if our hand contains any cards that will let us make another draw. We only change it back to true if we have a card in our hand that lets us make that kind of move. The first check we will add inside the loop is if we have the cards numbered 25, 26, 27, 28 and 31, i.e. the 5 pieces of Exodia. The only thing we'll do inside this if statement is set the Exodia variable equal to true, telling us we've won the game. There's no sense worrying about the other moves because even if we had other options we wouldn't care. Before this, we'll see our hand contains the cards Upstart Goblin or One Day of Peace. If it does, then that card is a guaranteed draw and we update our hand and deck accordingly. We remove the top card from our deck and add that card to our hand variable. Our following if statement is similar. Cup of Ace will allow us to draw 2 cards, but only if we first succeed in a coin toss. We create our if statement the same as we did before, only this time the first line of code inside the statement has to simulate this coin toss. Let's assign numbers to each side of a coin. Say that 0 is tails and 1 is heads. Much like we did with the deck variable, we'll create a sample of possible values, either 0 or 1, only this time we'll only take one value at random from our sample and this will be the outcome of our coin toss. Finally, we put another if statement inside that says if we get a 1, then once again we update our hand and deck. Notice here that I'm putting Cup of Ace card last in the code. For this small example, it doesn't really matter what order I check the cards in. However, in more complicated examples, you may want to consider things like putting risky moves at the end, as you may only want to use them as a last resort. For now though, let's just stick with these few cases to consider when making a move and carry on. The final if statement in our loops checks if we have any cards that allow us to draw again. If this is the case, then the drawing move variable is set to true, which allows us to go through the loop once again. Now that we're done simulating a single game, we increase our game counter by adding 1. We also add one final if that tells us to increase the number of successful games by 1 if our found Exodia variable is equal to true. The piece of code that says print is used to tell the user the number of successes. From this we can get a rough idea of the probability of succeeding in drawing Exodia using the rules we've added. And there we have it, a way to test how often our first turn kill deck will work. Obviously there are a lot more rules we can include which would improve our chances greatly, so please share your better combos in the comments. And thanks for watching.